We're back on the record. This is the matter of State of Ohio versus Michael T. Dixon. And Mr. Dixon is present along with his defense team. The prosecution team is here also. The jury is present, including the alternate. And I believe at this point the defense has rested and there's going to be no rebuttal case. So could we have closing argument from the prosecution, please?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Michael Dixon murdered James Whitaker. By his own admission, by his own confession, he said he shot him in the face with a 12-gauge shotgun, moved his body, he cut up his body, he burned his body. He did so deliberately to hide the murder that he committed. We heard that he spent hours, days, 10 to 15 days doing this to cover the traces of the murder so that you couldn't consider the evidence that we had against him. He used bleach. He moved the furniture. He cleaned the kitchen. He sold off property for meth. He gave property away. Anything that would connect him. He produced a fraudulent suicide note. A note that he knew that James Whitaker didn't even write. He repeatedly reignited that burn pit to make sure that no trace of James Whitaker remained. And then when some did, he took the jawbone. He put it under his bed. And then he pulverized it along with the teeth to make sure that no trace of him remained. Ladies and gentlemen, he did this to stop you from doing your job, from allowing you to review the evidence, for allowing you to be the trier of fact and to judge this. And in part, he was successful. He stymied law enforcement for a little while. He convinced the family. For 20 days, he was scot-free. For 20 days, he was living the life of James Whitaker, eating his food, sleeping in his house, moving the furniture to how he wanted it. But ultimately, the collective effort of those law enforcement agencies were able to figure out what happened. And admittedly, Michael Dixon's bumbling admissions and confessions and lies eventually were peeled back to reveal what actually happened. And today is when the 12 of you will hold him accountable. So thank you for your patience. As you promised when we started last week, you were going to be patient. You were going to listen to the evidence. And I certainly recognize that it hasn't been easy. You've heard a lot of testimony. You've heard a lot of recordings. Your job is going to be to sort through all of these lies. But this is where you apply that common sense that you promised, to help sift through that static, peel back those lies, rely on the circumstantial evidence, rely on the scientific evidence, rely on what we can confirm happened. In doing so, you will find that he is responsible and he murdered James Whitaker. You are here because of this man, a widower of Diane, who died 4 or so years ago, a father of 4 young daughters, a near lifelong resident of Hocking County. He moved back some time ago, lived right across the street from his friend of 40-some years. You heard that he was a natural leader, a kind man. He even opened his home to others, helped people that were in need. Unfortunately, the one that needed help was Michael Dixon. So typically what we do in closing arguments is to rehash the witnesses and the evidence. And so that's what we'll do. We'll spend a few minutes reminding ourselves of who participated the last week and what they had to say. And when we do so, remember the consistent theme that runs throughout this. I'm going to remind you, okay? So, this consistent theme, of course, deals with Michael Dixon lying. I think it's something we can all understand, that there are lies throughout. But know this, and I'm going to remind you this. You're not going to convict him because he's a liar. You're going to convict him because he's a murderer. But when you understand this and look through these witnesses and their testimony, understand that there's 2 different kinds of lies. There's the lies that he used to explain that he wasn't involved. This is the get out of free jail card. This is the lie that says nothing happened, everything's okay, don't look over here, don't look over here. Then there are the lies of, they know something's amiss. First lie is not going to work. Now, let me try to explain my involvement, mitigate the harm, mitigate that involvement. So we heard from Julie Whitaker, one of his 4 daughters. She told us about this man, about him being a leader. She told us that mother became concerned, and that's why her grandmother and James Whitaker's mother reached out to her to look for him. She called Keith Strickland. Keith Strickland had been over there a couple of times, had asked. Hadn't heard anything, so they need to investigate. That takes us to that July 25th day. Keep in mind that what we learned is that she advised law enforcement was on the way and to get out, and Michael Dixon leaves. And now, it's going to be hard for me not to mention what Michael Dixon just said as we go through some of these witnesses, so allow me a moment here. Keep in mind that what we are to believe is that when Michael Dixon said, Julie said to get out, he left. But when James Whitaker said to get out, he didn't leave. He went and got a gun. We heard from Craig Evelyn. Craig Evelyn talked about this man as well, but he also focused on that night in July 25th. He told us that Melody was there pacing around holding a crossbow. And then when asking about James Whitaker, she laughs. We heard from Ed and Susan Jester, friends of his for decades. James Whitaker, like we know, was there to help Michael Dixon out. He even put Michael Dixon upon the Jesters so that they could help him out as well. We know it didn't end well for the Jesters, but what Ed and Susan can tell us, they can help us tie this timeline down a little bit to help better understand what happened. Understanding that Michael Dixon admits that Melody had blood on her, and that on July 4th at around 10 o'clock, while Ed and Susan Jester had another couple over hosting, who shows up looking for gasoline? Melody. And Melody had blood on her dress, conveniently. Keep in mind, conveniently, what she's looking for, gasoline. We heard that earlier in the night, at around 8 o'clock, you heard this from Detective Kinnear, that Dixon had already purchased gasoline. He went to the convenience store, there was a purchase at the pump, and inside. We know he purchased gas. So 2 hours later, he's getting more gas down the road. Let's wonder why. Well, he needs a fire. He needs to burn something that's not going to naturally burn. Sure, he might have used that Coleman camp lighting fluid too, but he certainly used gasoline and used it from what Melody was trying to procure herself. We heard from Detective McKnight. Now, Detective McKnight at the time was a deputy. I bring this up because, again, the consistency of these lies. What you heard from McKnight was relatively eerie, knowing that there on an unrelated incident, something involving a firearm, not a consequence here, that he's standing feet away from human remains. And as you can see from that video, Melody places herself in between Deputy McKnight and those bones. Again, consistently, this is that first category of lie, trying to not be involved. This is a lie by omission. You heard from John Dixon, who of course did not want to be here that day. What's critical about John Dixon is he makes it sound like this murder was planned. Well, it's not deer season in July, so he comes over there, asks John to borrow a gun to go hunting. There's an argument, maybe because it's not deer season, wondering why you need a gun right now. Maybe Michael Dixon's planning this out. Either way, before the murder, conveniently, he gets a gun that's not his, not traced back to him. He uses the gun and then gives it back to John, but not just giving it back to John. He slides it under his daughter's bed. We heard from Jeff Amorine, who talked about his father and Jeff getting a TV. That TV, of course, is the one that Michael Dixon didn't want anyone to know about. We heard from Keith Strickland, James's friend for years, knew the family. He knew Jim well. He was a kind man, always lent a hand to others. That's why Keith was there, to fix his car. We heard that he was there earlier in the day before Dixon shot Mr. Whitaker, working on his car, doing some incredibly technical things and potentially dangerous things by replacing the struts on that vehicle. And that, of course, that Jim Whitaker was helping him out. Now, you will see this later when I present the charges to you. Keith Strickland helps Michael Dixon out, and he doesn't know what he's doing. Keith Strickland was asked to help clean up the kitchen and move furniture around. So I want you to think about this. Keith Strickland is either being manipulated to help cover up a murder, or he's being manipulated to help rearrange the home of a murdered man so the murderer can now live his life. Either way, what Keith Strickland demonstrates is what Michael Dixon did in the days and weeks following this murder, and what he did to either hide what he had done or to take on this life of James Whitaker. You heard from Keegan Rose. He spent hours and hours with BCI, the coroner's office that he's a part of, and Hocking County Sheriff's Office, poring over that burn site, that archaeological dig, because Michael Dixon did such a good job destroying the evidence. It took them days to recover this man's body. There are 206 bones in the body. They received and recovered just a small fraction of them, because that's what Michael Dixon did so well to destroy. You heard from a DNA, a serologist. She explained that those bones that were found were in fact James's bones, that the blood from the scene was in fact James's blood. But what she also told you is that this Remington 1400, this Winchester 1400 had blood in the barrel, human blood. Now, we heard the story, of course, that initially there was this question of whether or not the shotgun was almost a contact wound upon James Whitaker. but we went off that. So now this next shot, at least now the fourth or fifth story that the defendant told on the stand, what we're now to believe is that this shot was fired from across the room and impacted James Whitaker. Now we can't say that that blood in the barrel is James Whitaker's, but why else is human blood in that barrel? You can clean the outside, maybe you didn't think to clean the inside. The other thing that the DNA expert told us is, of course, that Winchester 1100, the one that apparently James Whitaker is supposed to be holding in his hand when his head is nearly blown off, causing blood to splatter everywhere. Kitchen, ceiling, pooling behind him, on the ground, the refrigerator, had to clean the windows. Blood is everywhere from that 9-pellet double-aught buck, and yet no blood whatsoever on that Winchester, the one he's supposed to be holding in his hand. Right hand or left hand, I can't remember what the story is from Mr. Dixon at the moment, but one of his hands. You also heard from law enforcement witnesses. Specifically, you heard from Detective Kinnear. Now, we watched a lot of video, and thank you for your patience. A lot of it was just abject denial and refusals to acknowledge what happened. Thank you for your patience, because it is important for you to see that. It's critical to understand how much and for how long he was denying that anything happened. I had a little checklist, not a checklist, maybe a counter. As I'm watching this, as I've watched it a couple times, when I was sitting here playing it for you, I tried to mark every time there was a lie. Not lies because I think they're lies. Lies because they're different things that he then contradicts later on. 56 times. I might have missed a few. 56 times he has been lying to you. He said, he was a dad to me. I wish I knew where he was. I went looking for him several times. In fact, even on the stand today, he said he went looking. And then when caught on cross-examination, he said, I told them I went looking. He said that he left in the middle of the night and took a 65-inch TV and a gun, but he didn't have a car with him. So maybe he's just walking down Chestnut Grove somewhere. Well, this evolution and regression of his explanation, it did not last. Because it starts off with, he just left. But that might make sense to my other friends who I'm using meth with, and I can convince them that he just left and no one's going to ask any questions. But now law enforcement is asking me. Well, maybe it could be suicide. I know Mr. Dixon doesn't remember today him mentioning suicide, but he talks about this well, that he could have shot himself and he's down a well. He specifically went to look for the well, couldn't find it on the 9 or 10 acres of property and looked elsewhere. He talks about this cave, not a well, now a cave. He also talks about an abduction that Andrea's people might have gotten him. So he's struggling and grasping at straws, trying to figure out, well, if law enforcement's not going to believe me that he just walked off, then I got to come up with something else. He even mentions this suicide note. He says he didn't write it. All right, you can compare his writing and the words he uses to his written statement, and you tell me if he didn't write it. But he produced it. He's the one who brought forth this letter and showed it and told Keith Strickland about it. So maybe Melody wrote it. Maybe he wrote it. But somebody, not James Whitaker, even by his own admission, it's not James Whitaker. Somebody brought this note forward. So once this first genre of lie doesn't work, that he wasn't involved, he's got to explain something to law enforcement because they're clearly not letting this go. They're not going to let me go back to James's house. He talks about this struggle first and an accident. And then he's defending himself. And then maybe his daughter's involved. And then, as we heard today, it's just himself again. Note that each time he tells his story, he makes sure that he says that he wants Melody out of it. Plain and simple, these witnesses laid out that Michael Dixon murdered James Whitaker. He destroyed the evidence that connected him to it, and he created evidence to distract others. So again, as you're working through this case and doing your deliberations, remember this progression of lies. In addition, when you think of this progression of lies, think about the lengths that he went to conceal this act. You'll hear that the court is going to give you jury instructions. The judge is going to read them to you, but he's also going to give you a copy. You're going to learn that testimony has been admitted indicating that the defendant attempted to conceal a crime. Concealing a crime may tend to indicate the defendant's awareness of his guilt. You may consider that evidence in deciding whether the defendant is guilty of the crimes charged. That means, ladies and gentlemen, that as Anthony and I are going to remind you, you must look at this case in the broad scope of what happened. What he did in the hours, the days, the weeks after, help inform you of what happened that night. Because someone who's claiming self-defense, someone who's claiming defense of someone else, they're not going to cut up a body. They're not going to burn a body. You're going to raise your hand and say, I'm a hero. I'm going to take you through some of the charges that you will be reviewing today. Now, as the court is going to explain, you will be required to find beyond a reasonable doubt that each of the elements of each of these offenses are met. And we'll certainly go through some of the elements and help you focus on what types of evidence and what types of things you should be considering when evaluating. I do want to understand and make sure that you all appreciate and understand and remember what we talked about reasonable doubt. The judge is going to again include in that instruction that you'll see the definition of reasonable doubt. Remember that you all agreed that beyond a reasonable doubt is not proof beyond any doubt. It's not proof beyond every doubt. It's not proof beyond all doubt. It's not proof beyond imaginary doubt. It's reasonable doubt. This is proof of such a nature that you would rely upon this evidence in the most important of your affairs. Now remember what we considered some of our most important affairs. Buying a house, getting married, getting divorced, having children. These are not things that we're 100% sure of. But when we do a little searching and think about it, use our common sense and weigh this evidence and weigh these factors, you can arrive at a decision. That's what you're supposed to do today, to use your common sense. First, I'm going to talk about count 4, tampering with evidence. Tampering with evidence is knowing that an investigation was likely to be instituted, alter, destroy, conceal, or remove anything with purpose to impair its value or availability as evidence in such investigation. Well, was there a homicide investigation at the time he burned his body? No. But why was he burning his body? Because he knew someone would be looking for him. We know there was an investigation or one likely to be instituted. Alter, destroy, conceal, or remove. And we're going to work through each of those. As you can see, he's charged with, I believe, 7 counts of tampering with evidence. Each one of them is going to be unique to a piece of evidence, and we'll work through them. But each time he's destroying, altering, concealing, or somehow affecting something to impair its value. Okay? I will tell you, where we get to most of this evidence is by his own admission. Relying on that admission, taking a look at the evidence that we have, and helping us to draw these logical inferences that support this decision. Our first one, and he produced cranial or jaw fractures to the bones of James Whitaker. Well, this is what he admitted to. Not today, but he admitted that he pulverized and smashed these bones, specifically the jawbone. Now, with regard to the skull, you heard from Angelo Hardin, now Dr. Hardin, I guess it's past Sunday, that there was blunt force trauma to his head. Yes, it could have been the shotgun, but it also could have been another instrument. And keep in mind what also could have caused this fracturing. Not just blunt force trauma, not just the smashing of a hammer or some other heavy tool, but the burning. That burning caused those fractures. We saw pictures of that. These are those fractures. Count 5. To break or cut the bones of James Whitaker. Well, I'm not sure why this is the fight that he wants to fight, but where Michael Dixon draws the line in the sand is that he didn't cut bones. He burned them for days. He put trash on a body. He shot a man, but he didn't cut up someone. Well, truthfully, the one thing that we can confirm, beyond reproach, beyond anything that he's ever told us, is that these bones were cut. Take a look at these images that Dr. Hardin provided us. Ladies and gentlemen, this is science, okay? These striations, you can see them going across on each of these images. This is something you can't contest. This one, of course, is the sharp force trauma that is a non-serrated blade. For some reason, he wants to say that these are the things that he didn't do. You know, and I can pull out each one of those gruesome weapons and show them to you. But like Dr. Hardin said, she can't say that's the one that caused it. Neither can I. I can't tell you it was that saw. I can't tell you it was that chainsaw. I can't tell you it was that massive machete. But what we can tell you is that these bones were cut. And he said no one helped him. So if anybody's cutting these bones, cutting these arms, cutting these legs, cutting these bodies, these body parts, it's Michael Dixon. And of course, as she noted, she confirmed that these two cuts, these three serrated cuts, are not from a chainsaw. But as you recall, what we have are these bone fragments. Hundreds of little bone fragments, these chipping of bones that have been subjected to fires for 15 days. Why else would James Whitaker throw a chain of a chainsaw in a fire? He's got the chainsaw in his car, but the bar is missing and the chain is missing. Count 6. The evidence that he destroyed in this count is the body of James Whitaker that he put in a burn pit and set ablaze. We know this because he admitted it. We know this because he said he put fuel on it to make sure it happened. As I said, he retrieved gas twice that night, once at 8 o'clock and again at 10 o'clock, when Melody had that blood on her. It took days to recover and account for how much burning he had done. The act of raking and putting trash on this body. This is like an archaeological dig that happens in Egypt. It doesn't happen in Hocking County. It shouldn't take days and days, dozens of workers, hundreds of hours between all of them to recover someone's body. And then in the end, only to get a small percentage of it. This is frankly not what should happen. Count 7. Okay, this is the burn pit. We know, of course, that this is where that residence is. The 292 feet to that burn pit. about that. Our burn pit, covered in trash. Keegan Rose and the investigators digging through it, trying to identify human remains. We know it was set ablaze because, of course, the admission, but we also have the testimony from Ms. Hardin that explains the charring and explains this calcification process on these images here on the left, on the right. Count 7. That Michael Dixon cleaned and rearranged the location of where James Whitaker was killed. Again, we know this because his admission. We know this because this is what Keith Strickland said he did, how he helped. We know that allegedly, the refrigerator was somewhere in this location, and you can still see the white marks on the window. This kitchen was moved around because, of course, he was covering up the blood. And he said when he moved the refrigerator that there was blood on the ground. Count 8. Is that he stole, sold, or destroyed a flat screen TV. We know he did this because he admitted it, because Jeff and Kenny Amrine said that they had these TVs. Now, this is not just the stealing and selling of a TV to buy some meth or to trade for meth, as he said. He told you, and he told law enforcement, that the reason he did this is because it had shot shell in it or blood. Well, we know there wasn't shot shell in it, but the blood, of course, is something that he would have wiped off. Count 9, tampering, is that he produced a fraudulent suicide note purported to be written by James Whitaker. He's admitted that this note wasn't real. He admitted it, that this is something that he used to try to suggest. He told law enforcement, he told Keith Strickland, he told Detective Kinnear twice. Take a look at this note. We heard from Keith Strickland, we heard from Julie Whitaker. This is not the writing of her father and of his friend. Count 10, again, tampering. That in order, in knowing that an investigation was likely to be instituted, he altered, destroyed, concealed, or removed anything to impair its value or availability of evidence. In this case, he removed a Remington 1100 and a Winchester 1400. He knew that both of these were going to be instrumental in any evaluation or investigation of his claim of self-defense. The Winchester 1400, of course, because that was the weapon that killed James Whitaker. But he didn't want law enforcement to look at it. He didn't want them to review it, to analyze it. So he got rid of it. Count 11, gross abuse of a corpse. To treat a human corpse in a way that would outrage the reasonable community sensibilities. Understand that just about everything that Michael Dixon did with regard would and should offend reasonable sensibilities. You can pick whichever you want. Setting it ablaze, the smell of burning flesh, raking it repeatedly over that burn pit, or how about just simply laying it out there for days while he went and took a nap? And then when someone else came up, helped them fix their car, all while a body sitting out on July 5th, under trash, under garbage. Sexual battery. Michael Dixon engaged in sexual conduct with Melody Dixon, and Michael Dixon being the father of Melody Dixon. You're going to learn that in order for there to be sexual battery, by these instructions, that there must be sexual conduct. Sexual conduct is vaginal intercourse, cunnilingus, fellatio, digital penetration. Now, We didn't have Melody Dixon take the stand and say that I had sex with my dad. Michael Dixon didn't admit it. But what you heard was that there's only one bed in that bedroom. There's only one bedroom in the basement. And you heard those sounds of intimacy that Keith Strickland described. And when you think about it, just consider this letter. This is that second page of the letter. On the left-hand screen here is there's a second page of the letter, and here's a zoomed-in image. This is the letter, keep in mind, that either Michael Dixon or Melody Dixon wrote, and that this was their excuse for why it was suicide. With not knowing how things were between you and she. How could things be between Michael Dixon and Melody Dixon aside from father-daughter when talking about his love, his alleged love for Melody? He's talking about a sexual relationship. She is a being lovely and wanting to give a woman caring and love, not thinking of her wanting you and what you have for each other. He's describing, and by he, I mean Michael Dixon or Melody Dixon, is describing a love triangle. In order for there to be a love triangle, there must be some sort of sexual activity between Michael Dixon and Melody Dixon. Count 13. This is called engaging in a pattern of corrupt activity. Now, the defense counsel, when they started here last week, I guess it would have been Tuesday, with the opening statements, talked about some mass conspiracy. No, this is not a mass conspiracy. At the end of the day, what this is Michael Dixon, his daughter, his father, and maybe another unwitting individual did what they could to cover up this crime. Not a mass conspiracy. This is a few people banding together to try to get away with something. So in order to find the defendant guilty for engaging in a pattern of corrupt activity, you would find that while associated with an enterprise, did participate in directly or indirectly the affairs of the enterprise through a pattern of corrupt activity. Generally, that he engaged in multiple felonies in order to evade the detection and apprehension by law enforcement. Basically, what we're going to do is you're going to put it all together. Link it. In the center, we have our pattern of corrupt activity. These are the general connection that he used and committed these felonies to evade detection. Now think about this. The murder, counts 1 and 2 and 3, which we'll talk about, that you'll get to. That's what set it all up. Count 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. These are all the tamperings. These are tamperings that he committed. And for this charge to withstand, you need 2 or more offenses. You got about 10. In addition, when evaluating this charge of engaging in a pattern of corrupt activity, you consider what is an enterprise. Well, an enterprise is any organization or association or group of persons associated in fact. Obviously, if there was an articles of incorporation and they had an LLC, it'd be a lot easier to identify an enterprise. But you don't have to be official legal entity to be an enterprise. Criminal gangs generally aren't an official legal entity. In this situation, we've got Michael Dixon, Melody Dixon, Frank Specie, and Keith Strickland. Now the first 3 are kind of in that same common theme here. Michael Dixon is the main offender. He's the murderer. He's the one who's leading the charge on concealing this crime. But we know that Melody Dixon participated, trying to get gas after she's got blood on her. Somebody had to help him move that body out. You saw that. Imagine taking this sled to that cluttered house. He's not navigating that through there. He needs somebody to help him. You look how big Frank is, or excuse me, how big James Whitaker as compared to Michael. Melody, what you also learned when you heard that 17-minute interview of hers, she lied. She lied. She lied a lot. That's obstructing. She lied in an effort to prevent the apprehension, detection of Michael Dixon. Frank Spizzi, you heard that today. He lied. He pled guilty. These are charges that you can consider as part of this enterprise, as a part of this pattern of corrupt activity. And Keith Strickland, of course, unwittingly helped rearrange the kitchen. Now, when you're thinking about Melody Dixon's participation, look at this. I mean, I know we've got Michael Dixon here. He's been apparently putting on a little weight in the last few months. Do you think this man, skin and bones, hasn't slept in 3 days because of meth using, is able to move a 220-pound man out of that cluttered house by himself on this massive sled navigating through that hallway? No, he's certainly not. So a corrupt activity is engaging or attempting to engage in or conspiring to engage in any of the following. We've listed them out for you. Murder, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse, and obstructing justice. You will have this in your instruction. It will say that if you find 1, 2, 3, or 4, 2 or more of these offenses that happen, and that a few of those individuals all work together at some point in that concerted effort, then you have that finding of guilty. What you'll see, the real reason we're here today, the important reason we're here today, is for counts 1, 2, and 3. Count 1 is that Michael Dixon purposely caused the death of James Whitaker. And you'll learn from your instructions that someone acts purposely when it's his specific intention to cause a certain result. Raising a shotgun, sighting someone's face, and shooting it. That is a specific intention. He had the specific intention to shoot James Whitaker. And keep in mind, as you will hear in the instructions, if a wound is inflicted upon a person with a deadly weapon in a manner calculated to destroy life, the purpose to cause the death may be, but is not required to be, inferred from the use of the weapon. Well, if you put a 12-gauge shotgun to someone's head, that isn't a manner calculated to destroy life. You can then infer that it was his specific intention to kill him. For each counts 1, 2, and 3, you'll realize that there is a firearm specification that upon finding that he's guilty of this said offense, that you also evaluate whether or not he used a firearm to facilitate the offense. Again, a 12-gauge shotgun. Counts 2 and 3. When we talked to you on Monday, we talked about alternative charging, that the same conduct can be charged a couple different ways, and you can also find guilty on a couple different ways of charging the same conduct. The court's going to explain that you can, and that you should. Count 2 is slightly different than count 1, even though it's a murder, because in this instance, he's causing the death of James Whitaker as a proximate result of committing a felonious assault. Thus, count 3, felonious assault. You find that there's a felonious assault and it caused his death, then you would have a finding of guilty. What felonious assault is down there, that he knowingly caused serious physical harm to James Whitaker. Again, aiming a shotgun and intentionally shooting someone in the head knowingly is causing serious physical harm. And because of the commission of that caused the death, then you have a finding of guilty. Let's take a moment and truly understand what he's saying, this admitted conduct. The defendant in opening statement said that he wants you to focus on the 60 seconds leading up to James Whitaker's death, and that the state's going to be looking at anything but the 60 seconds. I ask you to do both. Look at what happened leading up to the death, but look at the broad context. Because when you try to figure out what happened in those 60 seconds, you're going to have to pick which of the 5 or so stories the defendant is using to help justify what happened. Keep in mind that he told so many stories about what happened that some of them are going to be bound to land near accurate. Some of them are going to have some grain of coincidental truth in there. Each time he gives this evolution of a story, he's seemingly feeling it out, figuring out whether or not the law enforcement is going to agree with him or figure out what happened. So let's take a look at what some of his stories were. This is the first one. This is with Detective Downs. Right hand, left hand. Right hand, left hand. James Whitaker has two hands on the shotgun. They're standing right next to each other. Michael Dixon explains how he's able to use this disarming technique, move the shotgun away from him, and aim it at Michael Dixon. Excuse me, at James Whitaker. Here it is. Very descriptive. He spent a lot of time explaining this. Then he realizes, oh, I've been asked where my daughter was. What's going on with my daughter? So now he's got to cope with a news story. James Whitaker was choking my daughter. Left hand, nope, wait. It's the right hand. And the left hand's on the shotgun. He's trying to figure out, as he's talking about this, how to explain the story and make sure his daughter can figure out what happened too. Now he's describing again that this left hand is the one involved. But that was the story on July 27th. Then you heard that on July 29th, it changed again. On July 29th, we hear this story. This is in your evidence packet. This is a still image that one of the detectives took a shot of. This is the perspective of Mike Dixon standing at the landing right before the start of that rise to get into the kitchen area. And this is this miraculous shot that he's talking about. He threaded 9 pellets of double-aught buck through there to hit this small image of a head. And he told you today, as he told the other day, I didn't know where my daughter was. She put her on the ground. I think she was in the bathroom. I'm not sure if this story is more believable or the other 2 or 3 stories. You will hear that the judge will explain that the state does not have to prove motive because, unfortunately, people kill people for lots of reasons, and we just don't always know why. In many situations, maybe like what happened here, the defendant knows. And maybe James Whitaker knew too. But looking for a motive or trying to reason or justify why someone did this or trying to understand a gruesome act is not what you're required to do. You don't need to get into his head and try to justify why he would do something like this. What you can recognize is he had 20 days to destroy the evidence and come up with a story, and to do everything that he could to prevent law enforcement from going back and reviewing it. You're going to hear that, as the judge will explain, intoxication is not a defense. So recognize that when you're evaluating whether or not you should believe Michael Dixon in whichever of the 5 stories he tells you, that he admitted that he was high on meth and awake for 2 to 3 days. Now, intoxication is not a defense. So it's not an excuse for what he did, but you can use it to help evaluate of whether or not this guy is telling the truth, the credibility of this guy. Keep in mind that I think on the stand today, he said that James Whitaker pulled a gun on him 6 times, allegedly. How in the world is this one different? He doesn't even remember what the circumstances of those other 6 are. Was it over his daughter? Was it over meth? Was it over rent? He has no idea. But this one, he says, this one is different. There's no haggling. There's no discussion about it. He doesn't leave. He just goes down and gets his own gun. And he told you, when asked, what made you shoot him? He said, I'm not sure. That doesn't sound like self-defense to me. You're going to get an instruction from the judge that talks about this instruction of what self-defense is for Michael Dixon. You're going to learn that there's 4 components of it. And that what the state is obligated to do is disprove one of them beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, what that requires to do is have some sense of belief of Michael Dixon's story. But even if you pick one of these 5 stories, even if you try to give him some credibility, some weight, keep in mind that this is Michael Dixon, this is James Whitaker's house. Michael Dixon had that opportunity to retreat. You'll learn that he must leave if he has an opportunity to leave. And what was behind him? The door. Instead of taking 1 step behind him to the door, he went allegedly down the steps and retrieved a shotgun. So even if you believe his story, and you shouldn't, my goodness, you should not, even if you do, understand that he should have left. On the eyes of the law, even if you believe that Michael Dixon is telling you some semblance of the truth, he was obligated to leave. But what I want you to do is take a step back and use your common sense. Recall what you have learned this past week. Because what you would have to do in order to believe this story is to believe someone who's lied repeatedly, confessed to lying, admitted to lying, confessed on the stand to being a liar, cut up a body, burned a body, and smashed the remains. This is something that a guilty person does. Because if someone is claiming self-defense, you scream and shout about it. You're the ultimate man. You're the ultimate father. You're the one who's defending yourself and doing it in the right. Now use your common sense. In addition, think about James Whitaker. This is his home. This is his castle. Even if you believe this confessed and admitted liar, his statement, acknowledge that James Whitaker told him to leave. Michael Dixon heard it. If anybody had a claim of self-defense that night, if anybody, it's the owner of the home. It's the man whose castle it was, the one who told the intruder the one who's been high on meth for 3 days, coming back allegedly at the middle of the night. That's the one who has the right to tell the man to leave. And when he says get out, you get out. You don't get a gun. You don't run downstairs. Who prevails on a claim of self-defense shouldn't be the last man standing. It's the one who has the best right. And don't give that right to Michael Dixon. You promised common sense, so use that common sense to recognize what happened to James Whitaker. Common sense to understand what Michael Dixon did. I'm not going to tell you that this is a simple case, but let's make it as direct as we can. There's nothing magical about what you need to do when you go back in that deliberation room or stay in this courtroom. There's nothing magical that you need to consider. There's nothing magical about the amount of time you need to consider it. You're not missing anything. You're not. Michael Dixon killed him. Michael Dixon cut him up. Michael Dixon put him in a burn pile and burned him for 10 to 15 days. Michael Dixon took over this man's home, his life, his food, his kitchen. He took it over. Bring him to justice and find him guilty. Thank you.